Welcome along to Steve Wraith podcast. I've got a fantastic guest lined up today. It's Macer Gifford, who I saw this morning actually on Good Morning Britain, interviewed about Shamima Begum's return to the UK, which of course has whipped up all kinds of controversy. Macer has written a fantastic book, which you can get on Amazon, called Fighting Evil. Andy McNabb, who's a good friend of mine, has actually done the foreword to that book, and it's well worth a look, and we'll give that a bit of a name check towards the end. But Macer, thanks for joining us, mate.
Great, it's good to be on.
Great to have you on. Just really just want to go back to your upbringing, I suppose. Really, where were you born, and what kind of upbringing did you have?
Well, I was born in the Cambridgeshire countryside. Really normal, very rural upbringing. I've got two brothers. Went to a small local school, and if I'm honest, I only got sort of political. I only got. I suppose I evolved into a humanitarian when I went to university and started working in places like Zimbabwe, the Congo. I actually went, when I was in Zimbabwe, I was working for a group called the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change. They were fighting against Robert Mugabe at the time, politically. And I did some great work with a guy there called David Coltart, of all names. He's a senator there who is a human rights activist as well. And I was just inspired by it, blown away by how people they don't have to wait for governments to do things. They took action themselves and affected great change. So I think that's really where there was the incubator of my later passions, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, the book, as I say, is widely available, doing very, very well. Let's go back to your first venture into politics, I suppose. I've read a little bit about you. You stood as a conservative. Is that right?
Yeah, so I went to Loughborough University. I had plans initially to join the army, the British Army, but it was really when I went to uni that I joined the local Conservative Party, that I started Googling what was going on in the world. I found out about this group called the MDC that was fighting for Zimbabwe, and I was totally inspired by it. So I ran for local government. I ran to be a councillor in a place called Shelthorpe in Loughborough. And my degree in politics and international relations was really a bedrock, a solid foundation to build on. Because after I left university, I went to Ethiopia to work for the British Council. Spent a few months there working mostly as an intern and as a temp, working on projects in rural communities where they were trying to get young women into politics. And again, I was just inspired by the local people and also by the men and women of the British Council, who were just doing the most amazing work with actually quite limited resources. They took taxpayers' money and actually spread it out quite widely. But it was I graduated right in 2009, right in the heart of the last Great Recession. I don't know if the time that we're living now counts as the third. That all the jobs were thin on the ground, and I almost sort of fell into the city of London, where I left Loughborough, went straight to London, and after a few short years found myself in foreign exchange.
Yeah, I mean, did you work as a currency trader, is that right?
Yeah, so I worked for a number of different companies, starting off with a company owned by a large British bank. The last company I worked for, and I was a broker, just essentially just selling currency all day. Then I worked in more niche areas of foreign currency, business development, that sort of stuff. And I was getting into smaller and smaller companies, boutique currency houses. And it was fine. I was in my late 20s. I was 20 when I left my job, when I decided to go abroad and actually help in the Middle East. I was 27 years old. So I've been in the industry for a couple of years. But I think this is actually kind of where everything starts to change for me, because as a currency broker, you're really exposed to what's going on in the world. And I think everyone can remember what happened in 2014, particularly that summer when Mosul fell. I think it was around June time. Yeah. And after Mosul fell, there was 100 days where Britain and America really weren't doing anything. There wasn't even any airstrikes in either Iraq or Syria against ISIS. So ISIS just completely exploded onto the world stage. They took all the to Crete. They took other large parts of Syria. They sieged Kobani. They also besieged Sinjar Mountain, where something like 20 to 30,000 Yazidi families had all swarmed up the mountain for protection. And I just saw the Middle East being ripped apart. And yet at the same time, I wasn't seeing anything from the British government. And I was every day going to work, doing the old, well, I was about to say 9 to 5. It was much more like 8 to 8 every day. I was just constantly reading the news, constantly seeing these horrible images. And I just, and like everyone else, appalled by it. And suddenly the idea of going out myself started to form in my mind.
Is it right that you didn't actually have any military training whatsoever before you decided to go out there and make a difference?
Yeah, well, it would come to pass that actually, believe it or not, this is going to sound crazy, not having military experience is actually an asset. Because at the end of the day, joining the YPG, the Kurdish People's Protection Units, it's a militia in northern Syria. It would later become the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the group that I would go on to fight for. And one thing that I noticed over the years were hundreds of people went, hundreds and hundreds of people from around the world, great people from Britain, America, Germany, Australia. They all went to join the Kurds to fight against ISIS. Many of them, in fact, probably most of them, were former servicemen. A lot of those people, though, really struggled to integrate with the YPG and its culture. After years fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, alongside armies that would give them helicopters if they needed it. They had medical, they had the ability to evacuate themselves and all the rest of it. In the YPG, it's a militia whereby the average YPG fighter is a guy who's 18 years old. He's only had a couple of weeks training with an AK-47. He's been put in a uniform and pushed towards the front line because at the end of the day, this was a fight against an annihilating force. The Kurds were losing when I arrived. So this was not a professional fight. This was an amateurish war that we haven't actually seen in the West since the First World War, really, where very similar circumstance, where Britain was under threat from Germany and packed off millions of young men, some under the age of 18, to fight against them in the trenches. And it was very much the same in Syria, where young boys were leaving their villages and queues were forming outside recruitment stations, outside YPG recruitment centres, all begging to go to the front line. And I was just watching all of this. I was watching the Middle East being ripped apart. I was watching the inactivity of the West, the fact that Britain wasn't deploying troops on the ground. It wasn't bombing in support of local people. And I actually saw this is more of an ideological fight for me. So I was under no illusion that I was some great soldier. I'm not a soldier. I've never been a soldier. Even after 3 years of fighting in Syria, I've never described myself as a soldier. I knew that by going out to Syria, what I was really doing was showing solidarity, that I was actually showing the best of Britain. So far, the only people, because Britain wasn't doing anything, the army wasn't deployed, the air force wasn't deployed, the only image we had of Britain in Syria was Jihadi John with his British accent, his cold, dead eyes locked onto the camera with a kneeling humanitarian at his feet, threatening the world. Instead, I wanted to go out as a British person to fight back against ISIS, to stand in solidarity with local people and hopefully shame the British government, shame them into showing them what they weren't doing, which was supporting local people.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone watching who has lived in a bit of a bubble, for the last 20 years, I mean, ISIS did, rise to frame, they proclaimed the caliphate, of course, and then they proceeded on a systematic case of mass murder, rape, and enslavement. And I mean, that is what ISIS was all about. And you've just mentioned Jihadi John, public beheading of journalists. I saw some, nowadays in this world that we live in, certainly with various, things like WhatsApp, for instance, those kind of videos of those beheadings, and I seem to remember some poor soul being put in a cage and set alight in the cage. Those kind of things became circulated around the world on something like WhatsApp, and for me, I found that horrific. And I'm not somebody who would have the bravery, I would say, to go across and take up the cause like you did. But that is in essence what ISIS were all about, isn't it, Macer?
Well, absolutely. I actually feel I know this for certain. I've spoken to a lot of current serving people in the British Armed Service, and a lot of my friends used to be in the army before, and I've just had a chat to them about Britain's response to the crisis and how we could have got involved, what might have been. And I know for a fact that if you had lined up 1,000 former service guys and said to them, by the way, there's 20,000 Yazidi girls trapped on a mountain in Iraq. I'm not saying deploy the British Army in Syria and Iraq. I'm not telling the British government to intervene militarily, but surgical strikes to liberate sex slaves, to smash the besiegers around Sinjar Mountain, to get those men and women off, and children off too. I know for a fact, even if it was done voluntarily, I bet 99.99% of those British service people would have stood forward. And there was something quite liberating about being a British man who actually... some people may disagree with this because it's there's moral positions on this, but I find it quite liberating as a British man to be able to say what's happening in the Middle East is absolutely appalling. There's a terror group that's ripping the region apart. I'm a sovereign individual. This is my life, and as long as I'm not breaking British law, I have the right to go over and put myself between the Islamic State and their victims, because I'm not there to fight the Assad regime. I'm not there to fight any other country or anything like that. I'm only there to defend local people against terrorists. And the thing that really, there's a few videos that I can remember, just as you say, the video of the man being burnt to death in the cage was a real trigger and something that you will always remember. Yeah. One of the videos that I will always remember is a room full of jihadis, and they're all in their early 20s. They're laughing, they're joking around. Apart from the AK-47s, the long beards and ragged clothes, it could have been like a university party or something of just a load of blokes laughing and jumping on each other and punching each other in the arm. But what they were saying was being translated underneath the video, and it was basically these young men had been out fighting for the Islamic State. They'd captured hundreds of young girls, and they were now going to be given their just rewards. They talked about checking their teeth, about how one wanted a girl who was 13 years old and she would have blonde hair and blue eyes. That's what he wanted. And I can remember watching this video consumed by rage. And I suppose that's why at the beginning of the book, the fact that the testimony, the sort of, I dedicated the book right at the beginning to my family, saying that anger took me to war, your love brought me back. It really was anger that took me to Syria. I just felt like I had to do something. So literally 6 months after they declared the so-called caliphate, I was already in Syria fighting.
I mean, you split from your girlfriend, and as you've just mentioned, your family, you left them behind. What was their reaction?
My family were sort of devastated. They were confused. And actually, this was one of the hardest things about going to Syria in that first year was the reaction to of my family. And I actually made it worse because I wasn't honest with them at all. And there's actually something really logical about what I did. My family, I told them that I was going to Syria to work with refugees, that I was going to be working in Turkey, that I was going to be working in Iraq, in refugee camps far away from the front line. And yeah, I went over, I joined the YPG. I was on the front line, and they found out the truth. The reason I lied to them, of course, was I thought to myself, right, I'll be going to Syria to fight for the next 6 months. If I wanted to, I could tell my family, be honest with them right now. But for those 6 months, their lives are going to be ripped apart. They're going to be confused. They're going to be angry. Every day is going to be a pain for them. Naively, I thought I could go, fight, and come back. But believe it or not, I don't want people to think that I'm too naive on this. I also realized that if I died out there without telling them, their pain is going to be magnified as well. because they would be confused, even more confused as to why I wasn't there. But over those 6 months, after they found out that I was there, I started doing media work. I was writing a lot. I created a social media profile, which I updated people with photos, with information about what was going on the ground. And with the more information I gave them, the more they knew about what I was doing, I suppose the calmer they got. They were still terrified for me, but it was only when I really got back after that first trip, looked them in the eye, gave them the hug in that hotel near Gatwick Airport when I first met them after that first trip, did they truly start to understand. And as the years progressed, although they weren't packing my bags for me, I think they realized that what I was doing out in Syria was worthwhile. Every time I did a post on the front line, sometimes it was getting millions of hits. I was writing articles for national newspapers, all calling for Britain and America to step up, to fight back against ISIS and support local people. So to basically tell the world that if you're looking for the answer to the Islamic State, don't look to the US military or to the British military. Don't think that we can bomb our way out of this problem. Instead, realize that actually there are local people on the ground who believe in democracy and secular values. And if we support them, then we have a great chance to create long-term peace in Syria. So, that was one of the most difficult things about being in Syria was my family.
How well organised were the Kurdish YPG, and how did you adapt to being involved with an organisation like that? Because not being military trained, to then illegally cross the border into Syria and join this organisation, but then to have to essentially pick up arms and be involved with them. I mean, how well organised were they, and how did you find that experience?
They were very well organised. They transformed over the 3 years that I was there. When I first arrived, as I said before, ISIS was losing. The YPG was losing, the Kurds were losing, the Islamic State was spreading so unbelievably rapidly. They had captured a huge amount of weaponry, billions of dollars worth of weaponry from both the Syrian conscripts and the Iraqi conscripts that they defeated. Tens of thousands of people from around the world were flooding in. There was something like 7 million people that lived in the areas that they conquered. These people could be conscripted, they could be taxed, they could be forced into labor. People don't like to say this, but the so-called Islamic State actually began to resemble a state pretty damn quickly. And when I arrived, the YPG was in its infancy. It was recruits from all across the Kurdish regions of the Middle East were flooding in, wanting to join the YPG and fight back. Often villagers, young men were just taking their grandfather's AK-47, stuffing their jean pockets with bullets and running to the front line. That's how desperate it had become. So from the get-go, I was thrust onto the front line, but mercifully, the front line that I joined was pretty quiet for the first couple of months, which I think gave me that time to integrate myself with other international volunteers, some of whom were former service people, and to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut, my ears open too, and to really learn from local people. And as the years progressed, the relationship I formed with the YPG only grew and developed. I very much began to integrate myself with the Kurdish culture, the Kurdish way of fighting, the Kurdish way of living, so much so that in 2016 I was even given the chance to create my own tabor, which is a unit, and I was one of the first international volunteers to become a commander of the YPG. This was a small medical unit that I created, bringing in former service people from Britain and America with medical experience, and just utilizing my own experience as someone who can organize stuff to bring in ambulances, medical equipment, and that sort of stuff. It was tough to integrate myself, but it was something that I think I eventually got.
Yeah, in the write-up on Amazon about your book, you describe a lot of the international volunteers as remarkable and eccentric band of people. Tell us a little bit about some of the people who were out there alongside you.
Yeah, well, I think that might be a bit of an understatement, that one. So the international volunteers, I like to call them a broad church. So it's just frustrating. So hundreds of people from around the world went. And of course, if you're going to recruit off the internet, and if you're going to throw open the doors as the Kurds did and say, look, we need your help, we need international solidarity, come and support us, there will be a few bad eggs that will turn up. So there'll be some interesting characters would turn up. And my battle over the years was actually to make sure that the voices of the international volunteers who were genuinely there for the right reasons, who were the most remarkable, actually came to the fore and were heard. So over the years, some 40 international volunteers from around the world would actually die fighting against the Islamic State and other jihadist proxies in Syria. That's 40 incredible people, because the Kurds never really put you on the very front line and integrated you with a Kurdish unit unless they really trusted you. If they recruited 20 people and 20 people were going through a training academy, they would always keep their eye on the international volunteers. And if there was one who seemed to be sort of bloating his military experience, lying or whatever else, they were typically put into a unit that stood guard duty for 6 months in a desert position that hadn't moved for about 3 years. Whereas people who actually bothered to learn the language and actually integrate themselves with the Kurds were actually free to join whatever unit they wanted. That's why the international volunteers suffered so many casualties, in fact. 40 dead is probably about nearly 10% of the international volunteers that went to Syria that fought on the front line were actually killed. More than 10% were actually wounded. In certain battles, international volunteers, the casualty rate was something like 50% dead and wounded. So you had to be committed. You had to be absolutely assured of what you were doing if you were going to join the YPG. I've heard of one story where an American guy turned up in Iraq. He got picked up in the airport, driven to the border, the Syrian-Iraqi border, to a river, the Tigris, I think. The guy pointed to the other side and said, "There's Syria. We'll give you your uniform when we get to the other side of the river." This American said, "Actually, I've made a terrible mistake. I can't do this. I've got to go. You've got to take me back to the airport. I'm going home. By the way, I don't have enough money for the return flight. Could you pay for me?" So the Kurds actually ended up paying $1,500 to send this sort of fat American back to the United States. And that's an example of the very worst of the international, some of the very worst of the international volunteers that turned up was just people who didn't perform and didn't do what they should have done. But I think on the whole, the international volunteers added a huge amount of international solidarity to the Kurds. And and although I've been quite critical right now about some of the international volunteers, I wouldn't want people to go away thinking that was the norm amongst the international volunteers. Instead, I actually most like to describe the international volunteers as very much like the young men and women that joined the sort of socialists, the international brigades in Spain, fighting against the fascists there. People like George Orwell, etc. They actually went to fight because they were fighting against fascism. And what's a better description to what we were fighting against ISIS? So, yeah.
We hear a lot of stories. I mean, Andy McNabb's books are full of them, of the physical and mental battles that.
Have I lost you?
Can you hear us? Can you still hear us? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, I lost you for a second.
No problem. Yeah, we hear a lot of stories, especially in books by the likes of Andy McNabb and Chris Ryan, about the physical and mental battles that hardened servicemen have. Have you suffered anything along those lines? I mean, PTSD is something which tends to hit people after they've been to this kind of thing. Have you had anything like that?
Well, yes, I think this experience has given me a huge appreciation for those that fight for us, the British Armed Services, and it also shows me how insidious post-traumatic stress can be. That actually you don't even know if you have it often. It's how can you fight something that you can't sometimes often pin down and know exactly what it is? Believe it or not, post-traumatic stress for me, or my experience of it, has evolved and changed over time. One thing I would like to say straight up is that I don't believe that I suffer from it. But it's little things like I will often, when I first came back from Syria, I would often identify things with gruesome things. So I would get out at a service station, at a petrol station. I'd look down at some oil on the ground and think to myself, that looks like Bake's blood. And there are other things as well. A couple of kids had burnt a bin on my street, and as I was walking past it, the plastic bin had melted down, and out of the corner of my eye, it looked exactly like a load of burnt bodies. So there are things that come into your mind at the sometimes most inappropriate moments, and you sort of force them back. And then you actually start. Then in the second year, I moved past that. I no longer saw those sort of things. And then it would come creeping back, particularly if I start remembering certain incidences that happen. And I do something which I think a lot of service people will now criticize me for. I just don't think about anything often. I've moved away from it. It's in my past. I couldn't change it. I've moved on. And incidences where people died in my arms, at the time when I thought about them, it was like my head was going to explode. I can remember physically shaking my head to try and scatter the thoughts that were in my mind. And then when I realized that actually I could push it down and forget about it, and actually I have forgotten about it and I've moved on, I'm actually very grateful for that. But I think that also shows to you and proves to you that my post-traumatic stress is pretty damn minor. And so what little experience that I have of it fills me with awe of the bravery and the courage and the tenacity of people who are really crippled with post-traumatic stress because they've seen their brother, their best friend die in their arms, or they've felt the loss of seeing their friends go on a patrol and feel like they should have been with them when something bad happened to them. And so I can relate so much more to that. But to answer your question directly, I don't feel like I have post-traumatic stress. And I'm just so grateful for that.
The military defeat of ISIS was in 2017, obviously in the ruins of Raqqa, as again described in your book. What was it like those final days when you were reaching the end game?
The last few weeks, so the book's was a real challenge to get right, by the way. So this is 3 years. I was in Syria for 3 years. The battle space changed enormously over that time. The YPG right at the beginning was losing. It was underfunded. It had barely enough bullets to go around. Each recruit, before they were sent to the front line, were only allowed to fire sort of 5 or 6 bullets, just because they didn't want to waste any ammunition. By the end of the conflict, the arrival of Donald Trump meant that there was air cover all the time. The equipment that the Americans provided, from Humvees to much better weaponry, was extraordinary. So the military force that I left in 2017 had changed. And was almost no longer recognizable. In Syria, in Raqqa, and the reason why I tell you all that is to distill all of that information into a book that's 85,000 words long is a mammoth task. So instead, I have to skit over things a little bit. I have to sometimes take an incident and make it an example of what really was going on at the time, etc. So the last couple of weeks in Raqqa was one of a little bit of boredom mixed with the odd moment of extreme tension and fear when ISIS were trying to break out of their positions. Because what really happened was, towards the end of the conflict, the last couple of weeks, it became a hostage situation where we had surrounded the big hospital in Raqqa and the stadium as well. The days of actually having to push forward, liberate territory, and get into some horrendous combat with the Islamic State was largely in the past. Actually, the last major fight that I had in Raqqa was an operation to cut the link between the hospital and the stadium. In fact, it was quite one of the most defining operations of the siege of Raqqa. And after that, it was then weeks of then watching the Islamic State hold something like 600 hostages in the hospital, and the fear that they would begin executing all the female slaves that they had brought in with them. We did assault the hospital on several occasions, but every time we always lost 2 or 3 guys doing it, and we got absolutely nowhere. So a picture was emerging towards the end that to defeat the Islamic State, we had to annihilate the civilian population of Raqqa, which had been held captive in these areas. So a negotiation process began with ISIS. They were given the chance to flee the city, but as long as they left the heavy equipment, they could take small arms, their AK-47s, they could feel like they had some sort of credibility. But in terms of their heavy machine guns, obviously artillery pieces and mortars, etc., if it was small enough to get into a bus, then they were welcome to go. The YPG knew, the SDF knew, that they would just simply find these guys out in the desert later and kill them with airstrikes and at range. The huge fortifications that they built around the hospital and around the stadium were just, after 2 years of being built, were just extraordinary. The hospital essentially was one large pillbox. If anyone's been to the Middle East, certainly in Syria, the hospitals and the sort of the schools, I'm sure they're pre-packaged concrete buildings. They all look the same. The hospital was a giant concrete pillbox with anti-tank ditches dug around it, ditches for, there was machine gun nests, there were sniper holes, there were mines everywhere as well. The inside, they even had internet inside. They had generators. They had a huge amount of food and weaponry that would last them months. And it was not a foregone conclusion that they would ever actually surrender. Apparently, there was all kinds of fighting going on inside the hospital, debates between people of whether or not they should fight to the death, whether they should execute people, whether they should perform stunts like decapitate people and throw their heads off the top of the building as an act of defiance. And they were doing things like hanging children out of the windows of the hospital to stop us from firing at them. So the situation became pretty bleak. So but also became a bit boring because we were just watching the hospital all the time, waiting for someone to negotiate a peace treaty. Every now and again, they would try and break out, as I said, and there'll be moments of conflict. But largely, the last few weeks of Raqqa showed me that actually this was a foregone conclusion, and this was the end of ISIS. Had happened a few weeks before. This was just the final death knell. And by the way, after they left, there was fighting for another year in Syria, but it was largely, and it would finally end in the Battle of Baghouz on the banks of the Euphrates, where thousands of ISIS fighters literally just died in ditches. They were literally caught out in the open in quite a small village for the thousands and thousands of people that were trapped there. But it showed you the mentality of the ISIS fighters that we were battling against. They fought to the very end and to the last bullet. They only left when they were surrounded and being bombarded on a daily basis. And let's not forget, since her picture is behind you, that Shamima Begum was with them the entire way. In the 5 years that she spent in Syria, she had plenty of opportunities to leave the so-called caliphate, but she only left when its destruction was all but complete. So I think that shows you a little bit about the mentality of some of the people in Syria.
Let's move on to Shamima Begum. Of course, anyone who doesn't know who she is, she was one of 3 schoolgirls who left London to join the Islamic State group in Syria in 2015. Last year, 2019, her citizenship was revoked by the Home Office on security grounds after she was found in a refugee camp. We've now since been told this week that she should now be allowed to return to the UK to fight the decision to remove her British citizenship. The Court of Appeal has ruled that. And this is what brought us together, Macer. I saw your interview this morning on Good Morning Britain. And I've got to be honest, I was touched by it. I thought it was a great interview. It was great to see one of the national TV channels actually give you an opportunity to speak about this and speak in a matter which I think a lot of British people would have agreed with.
Yeah, well, basically, I think 90% of people in the UK are scared and angry at the government and with the human rights lawyers who seem to be putting the rights of the Islamic State prisoners, the Islamic State fighters and their jihadist wives above that of local people in the UK that just want to live their lives, that want to travel on the underground in peace. They want to send their kids to school in the knowledge that a jihadist is not going to come in with a knife. At the end of the day, I think there's another real problem here, and that is that we're not focusing on who the real victims are here as well, because no one's said anything about the fact that the Syrian Kurds are the ones that captured Shamima Begum. They're the ones who have seen 12,000 of their fighters die, tens of thousands of the civilian population die, and no one's talking about what justice they might want for Shamima Begum, whether they want to put her through some sort of judicial system. So I hope that people wise up to the fact that these people are incredibly dangerous, that they have received years of intense ideological and military training, and it just takes one. It just takes one of them to commit a terrible crime in the UK, and it begs the question: what do we owe these people? If they're willing to leave the United Kingdom, rip their passport up, and declare war against us, why now are we debating what rights they have and whether or not they should be somehow rehabilitated into British society? I think justice has to come first, punishment has to come first, and then we can talk about rehabilitation and whether she should come back. But yeah, justice is the key word here.
I think we'll obviously watch this with interest. I think there's a lot more to develop from this. And of course, should she be allowed to come back, then, you know, it opens the floodgates, doesn't it, for others to join her.
So yeah, I don't know. Hopefully my side's good for you, but my audio is really bad at the moment. First of all, can you hear me well? And could you repeat that question?
Yeah, I can still hear you. Yeah, I'm just saying if Shamima Begum comes across, you know, to England, comes back home to face the music, then obviously it's going to open the floodgates potentially for others to come back to the UK as well. And that's what you've said. You know, that is the big concern for the British public. The next person who comes across could be somebody who, you know, could certainly take lives by committing another act of terrorism.
Yeah, well, the door's been opened, and there are dozens of international fighters from the UK who've joined ISIS who are currently in prison cells. Several of them were former members of the so-called Beatles. These are the people who worked with jihadi John to capture, torture, and then eventually murder journalists and humanitarian workers. These people, and I've described it in my book and I've described it in the media, they are the SS of the Islamic State. These are the people who are so fanatically committed that they're willing to travel 1,000 miles to join ISIS. They're willing to battle on the front line, risking life and limb for the Islamic State, and then they'll only surrender once the Islamic State is militarily defeated. To suddenly say, well, these people they were very young when they left, they had personality conditions, health conditions, possibly mental conditions, and the human rights lawyers tend to start, and we sometimes, which rather frustrates me, we start to evaluate what have we done wrong as a society? How have we failed them to encourage them to go abroad and fight in Syria and Iraq? And I'm quite sick of that narrative, that they're somehow a victim, and that somehow we failed them. No, they're the ones who were given every opportunity to succeed. They were the ones who were granted access to the UK society, to our democracy. Yet they chose to rip up their passport and go abroad and fight. So there's many different ways that we can look at this. We can look at it from a moral perspective about whether we should bring justice and focus on justice for the Yazidi people that were murdered. There's a legal perspective about the chance that dozens of international fighters will come back. It will cost millions of pounds for the British taxpayer. Once they set foot in the UK, they'll never be allowed, they'll stay. It'll be almost impossible to deport them, because where will they go? Are we sending them back to Syria, to a war zone? I'd like to see that stand up in a British court. So, and there's plenty of ways to look at this. But all I want the government to realise is that overwhelmingly the British people don't want it to happen. They're afraid, they're concerned, and they're angry. And that they think, as far as they're concerned, Shamima Begum and others have made their bed and they should lie in it, as far as they're concerned, as far as I'm concerned too.
Yeah, I think the majority of the British public would agree with you. Before we finish, just want to know what else you're up to now, Macer. I mean, I think you're heavily involved, as you say, you're an activist. But what else are you up to at this moment in time?
So I left Syria and I was tired. I'd been fighting for 3 years. I'd actually felt incredibly privileged because I'd seen the YPG develop into the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. I'd seen the worst of the world. I'd seen the worst of the Islamic State, for everything from their propaganda to their victims. And I've seen an entire country destroyed. But at the same time, I saw the goodness in people. I saw local people fighting back. I saw the goodwill that was directed at me for doing what I thought was right. And I left just incredibly tired that actually I felt like, and hopefully I don't sound too big-headed here, because I honestly wrote this in the last chapter of the book, that actually I felt like I achieved in Syria exactly what I set out to achieve. Like, it's bizarre that often most of the things in life you try and it always works out slightly different to how you would envisage it. But actually, on the whole, how I envisaged my participation in this conflict and I would learn and what I would do has largely been quite consistent. And I'm left now with a sense of satisfaction that I did an incredibly moral thing, and that I stood up for my principles as a British man, someone who believes in democracy and equality and humanism. But at the same time, tired that I'd seen so much war. So over the past few years, I've written the book. I've gone back to university to study for a master's. I've enjoyed writing, and I'm considering writing a book now. And I just hope that everything that I do from now on is to advocate for local people in Syria and Iraq, because they're the real heroes here. All I have been, and all the international volunteers have been, is a spotlight that shines on local people in Syria and Iraq who have fought back against ISIS and won. So I hope British people watching this will say, do you know what, the SDF are good people, and if there's anyone to support in Syria, it's them. And they should go away and learn a little bit more about them. And I'm sure they'll be absolutely proud of them and really interested in what they've got to say.
Last question, Macer. If it all happened again next week, would you make the same decision? Would you be getting the passport out and getting yourself across there again?
Man, I would go in a heartbeat. And it's not because one thing is that I don't want to sound too bombastic. I don't want to sound too gung-ho. One thing that life has taught me over the past few years is that you have to treat war and fighting with a huge amount of respect. When you first arrive, you're like a dog on the leash. All you want to do is fight, and you spend half your time begging for a scrap. But then you get one, and then you spend the rest of your time begging that you're out of it, and that you'd actually much rather sit on the front line drinking tea and having a cigarette and feel like you're doing the fight that way. But I will always stand up for what I believe is right. I genuinely think this is the most clear-cut division between good and evil since the Second World War. These people are fanatics. They're the lowest of the low, the black flag of jihad, and everything that they've tried to do in the Middle East is to erode and destroy the culture and history of the region. So us, as British people, as Westerners, as people who value life, we should do everything we can to fight back against them, because that's the only thing we can do. We can't negotiate with them. We have to defeat them.
Fighting Evil, The Ordinary Man Who Went to War Against ISIS by Macer Gifford. It's available on Amazon. If you want to get in touch with Macer, he is on Twitter at Macer Gifford. Macer, I just want to thank you, mate, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and good luck with all your endeavours over the next 12 months.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
Cheers.